Hello there, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Cambridge Inside Out. My name's Robert Winters, and today is what is today? It's actually Constitution Day. So it's September 17th, 2024. It is Constitution Day, for those who were not in the know, marks the day of the signing of the United States Constitution on September 17th, 1787. So congratulations to Ben Franklin and the boys. Uh, Job well done. Uh, so what I'd like to do just for the first part of tonight is to talk a little bit about some people and also an event which happened just a few days ago over at Joan Lawrence Park in mid-Cambridge called the Open. It was actually called the Open. I've been going for years to these open archives where you sort of go from place to place around town, from Mount Auburn Cemetery archives, various Harvard libraries, Harvard art museums, Cambridge Historical Commission, Cambridge Historical Society, and several more. But this year they decided to consolidate them all and put them all over in front of the main library in mid-Cambridge. So they just had separate tables for everything. It was actually really, really well done. I enjoyed it a lot. And just to uh, mention, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop over to the share here just a little bit to talk about this. Here we go. Um, it was called the Archives Road Trip. So there was representation from the Cambridge Black History Project. And for those who've never gone on some of the Black History walks, or they call them the strolls, they're really, really quite fascinating. And I've been around long enough now that I actually know some of the people who are featured during these events here. Actually, I think I can get a little bit better resolution with that. There we go. History Cambridge, which is I guess the current name for the Cambridge Historical Society. George Stylianopoulos from Department of Public Works had some really sort of historic books, maps, drawings, just a lot of stuff. I mean, there's a wealth of archival, amazing things, really works of art that are being stored over in the archives of the Cambridge Public Works Department. The city clerk's office was great. They were actually offering, if people wanted to get their birth certificate, at least for people who were born here, you just had to fill out a form and they were going to get that to you. And they're always very, very informative. The people from the Longfellow House were there, Harvard Art Museums, Meg Thompson from Winslow, I think I hope I got it right, from Mount Auburn Cemetery Archives was there. MIT Libraries, Cambridge Historical Commission, the Harvard Plate Stack Collection. That's actually some of the I think of the ones for the astrophysical ones. They actually had some representatives from those, and I was good friends with the person who used to be the curator of those plates, so the astronomical ones. Leslie Archives and the Schlesinger Library. I'm going to particularly focus on the ones for the Schlesinger Library here, because it was sort of an interesting little bit of serendipity that ensued as a result of that. So and I'd never actually gone to the archives from the Schlesinger Library, but they actually had some postcards, and one of the postcards they had was this one right here. As soon as I looked at it, I said, wait a minute, that's Boomer Kennedy, right? And some of you may know Boomer Kennedy she ran the Chicago Auto, which was, I believe, on Brookline Street many years ago. Then she moved on. She actually went into working in, as a chef, and moved on. So it was great. So they actually didn't know who she was, So, but I remember I didn't know her personally, but I do remember Chicago Auto as sort of a fixture in that part of Cambridgeport. I even get a button with her name. Now, the serendipity part of this was that this was also the first weekend of what they call Meet Your Neighbor Day, Meet Your Neighbor Day or Meet Your Neighbor events that Brian Corr from the Peace Commission assembled, invited people. You could actually get a little bit of a stipend. Actually, in my neighborhood, mid Cambridge, they used it to help support the ice cream social, which actually took place on Sunday. Sunday, I think it was Sunday. Yeah, and yeah, Sunday. with ice cream provided by our own Gus Francatori from Tuscanini's. That was a great time, very successful event. But I wanted to particularly mention the thing about Boomer Kennedy because um, what I had also then gone just prior to it. I guess the open archives was on Saturday. So then I went on Sunday. I was at one of the Meet Your Neighbor events in Cambridgeport, a block away from where Boomer Kennedy's Chicago Auto was located. And this one was hosted by the mayor, Denise Simmons. So we were talking, and I thought we just mentioning things about Boomer Kennedy, and it was a real. And so we were recalling a time back in the 60s and through the 1970s. I got here in 1978, so I'm only part of the sort of tail end of a lot of it. But there was a whole movement toward women in the trades. One of my neighbors, Sharon Bocelli, well, former neighbors now, she was like the first lady butcher in Massachusetts. And I was talking with Denise about Barbara Taggart, who was my plumber. And, we talked about Boomer Kennedy and, there really was quite a movement. And in fact, just to sort of say a little bit something about it, it was one of the fellows I know, a friend of mine who sells books in front of City Hall periodically, a guy named John Graham. He actually gave me this book here called No Bosses Here, a Manual for Working Collectively, which is published by the Vocations for Social Change, which was the successor organization to something called Trout Fishing in America, named after a Richard Brautigan book that was located on Prospect Street, where they were trying to create alternatives for high school age kids, teaching them photography, the trades, and that eventually moved over to 353 Broadway, which incidentally is diagonally across from where I live. And when they moved out, they continued publishing some things, but then that became the site of the Broadway Bicycle Collective, which again was sort of part of that whole movement of no bosses here, and also women's in trade, which was they were kind of happening somewhat simultaneously. And that's today the Broadway Bicycle School, right? So just wanted to give people a little bit of perspective about the Cambridge that used to be, you know, you know, back when we really were, much more organically trying to change the world here, by creating food co-ops and things that were much more community based than most of the kind of activism that you typically see today. Anyway, so after I left the Meet Your Neighbor event with Denise Simmons, I just happened to be walking back to my car, and who do I see walking down the street but Barbara Taggart, my former plumber, and one of the great women in trades. And I mentioned that. I mentioned Boomer Kennedy, and she said, "Well, I wonder how I haven't seen her in years. I wonder how she's doing, what she's up to." And anyway, it's a sort of a sad tale because I have to say that when I went back to my house soon thereafter, or later that night, I decided to go and just Google and see if I could find out what happened to Boomer Kennedy. So again, bit of a sad tale here, but apparently Boomer Kennedy passed away in June of this year. After operating, she ran 20 years. She ran the Chicago Auto in Cambridge, and then moved on to become a pastry chef, and then on to Albuquerque, Santa Fe. Many people who've been around Cambridge for a long time will remember Boomer Kennedy and Chicago Auto, and then eventually ended up in Baltimore, as it was described, serving as an unofficial mayor of the Patterson Park Community Garden, treating all passing dogs and people to cookies and good conversation. So that was Boomer Kennedy, and I think just as just a little bit of memory of where we were relative and compared to where we are today, right? Now, again, I'm not trying to focus on the sort of somber events, but I also learned a few days ago, a local friend sent me a copy of an obituary for another Cambridge activist of some renown, and that was Bob LaTrémouille. So Bob LaTrémouille, many people in recent years probably know him more as, I think I actually have a better picture of Bob right here, as a person who was actively involved in and around, with the white geese that are inhabit the area and around the cottage farm pump station near the BU Bridge up over by Memorial Drive. He sort of turned this into a bit of a, a personal cause, that really transcended many, many years. Uh, so anyway, so that was Bob LaTrémouille. I learned a few things when I first knew Bob LaTrémouille. By the way, he was, well, I'll just read a few things right here. So he passed away at the age of 81. I don't believe I didn't know he was actually a Cambridge native. So that was news to me. Um, he was involved. He was doing working as an extra in some movies. You might actually see him as a face in the crowd in some films. Um, and he was a veteran, and I didn't know that either. And he, at this point, because since this happened, he passed away also in June, just 8 days after Boomer Kennedy, and is at this point, I'm sure would be buried at the Massachusetts National Cemetery. So again, these are sort of sad events. I will just mention, some people had issues with Bob. I had issues with Bob. Bob sometimes would rag on me on CCTV, calling me part of the Cambridge machine. But I never held it against him. And, we just had different points of view. And I, well, I do recall, and I speculated that this was sort of the beginning of his interest in the geese down at Magazine Beach, which are not indigenous geese. They were brought in as essentially pets for somebody who worked at the cottage farm station. But he had a very active interest in transportation. And he was of the belief, as he explained to me many years ago, that sooner or later the Grand Junction Railroad would become a rapid transit or at least a trolley line, and he felt that there would be a stop would be built close to where the BU Bridge is, and that would lead to a significant amount of commercial development because that was kind of the big thing back in the 1980s, and at least through the mid 90s, there was a tremendous amount of commercial development happening in places, some places desirable, some places not so desirable. And I've always, and well, I may be wrong in this, but I always felt that, his, the cause of the white geese was sort of Bob's version of the snail darter, which was meant to, you know, create some obstruction to the development of an area that he would rather have seen not widely commercially developed. But in time, it really became, the cause was the geese, and I'm sure he and many other people, friends of his, essentially adopted the geese as sort of their, as their cause, right? So anyway, so there were a few other, again, not to be somber in this, but I noticed in the city council agenda from Monday, there was several death resolutions. One was for a gentleman named Red McGrail, who was, I didn't know him personally. I knew his son, we were fellow candidates together many years ago, Jimmy McGrail. But Red McGrail was a fixture in North Cambridge, so if you were not part of North Cambridge community, you might not know him, but if you were from there, you definitely knew who Red McGrail was. So anyway, he passed away recently as well. And as I'm sure everybody here knows, our city councilor, Joan Pickett, did pass away in the very end of the month of August after an illness. And there's a little bit more detail about that available now. And I'll just say that at the city council meeting of, I guess it would have been, yeah, immediately afterwards, so September 9th, there were statements by her colleagues that were very heartfelt and uh, tearful, at least in some cases of Councilors Siddiqui and Wilson, quite tearful, in that in the short time Joan Pickett served on the city council, she very much impressed her colleagues as a friendly person with a sense of humor, with a lot to offer, and they were very, very, very saddened by her passing. Um, I think it's probably appropriate that I should just mention a few other sort of practical aspects of what happens post passing of somebody, though. Uh, First off, it was announced on Monday that there will be a memorial for Joan or in a reception at Cambridge City Hall on Saturday, September 28th from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Her burial and service will be up in New Hampshire earlier in the day. So anyway, I am certainly planning to be there for that. Another something that I think, again, more in the spirit of an announcement I mentioned here is certainly the mayor, Denise Simmons, and others have been, who've been actively involved with the fledgling Cambridge Museum of History and Culture. They've put together a screening and a get together this coming Friday, September 20th, up at the Brattle Theater called Cambridge Mosaic, which will feature a half-hour program, recordings that was put together by my neighbors, Mitsuko Onishi and Larry Ward, featuring five memorable Cambridge individuals. One is Marvin Gilmore, who's turning 100. Marvin's a hell of a guy. Artist Spears, who runs the Spears Funeral Home and is really she and her entire family are an institution in Cambridge. Former city councilor and state representative Tim Toomey, uh, former city councilor, former mayor, and current Middlesex County Clerk of Courts Michael Sullivan, and my dear friend and the creator of the original Cambridge Inside Out, Glenn Kuchar, who also served for, I believe it was 10 years, it could be wrong a bit, on the Cambridge School Committee. So anyway, that's this Friday. So I've definitely got my tickets, and I'm definitely going to be there for that. So I wouldn't miss it for the world. So anyway, those are some of the things that are coming up, and in addition to some of the sad stories of the passings of some of our friends and neighbors. Um, Another matter that was sort of a big deal around here. Oh, and I should say, I mean, we talked about it last week, so there's no need to do it in great detail this week or 2 weeks ago, which is that with the passing of a city councilor, the vacancy is created on the Cambridge City Council, and the official replacement, there's no secret to it because the ballot data has been available ever since last November. But for those of us who were silly enough to be candidates last time, I got my letter, so, there I am down there at the bottom alphabetically, informing us of the official vacancy recount procedure, which will take place this Thursday at 5 p.m. There's not really much to see. I'll be perfectly honest with you, because all it is, you just modify a little configuration file. You press a button on a computer, it produces the results in 5 seconds. And it is Joan Pickett's ballots, and only Joan Pickett's ballots, the ones that were used to elect her, that will then be used to select her replacement. And though it's John Hanratty is in the lead for a while, eventually it becomes Kathy Zusi will be her replacement. So again, we know that to be the case, but this is still an official proceeding. So officially, the election will not take place until this Thursday. My presumption is that there's really nothing obstructing Kathy from then being inaugurated at the very first city council meeting, which will be next month, this coming Monday. So I don't think there's any reason for any delay, and I think to delay would be problematic indeed. So anyway, so that's coming up. Now, on the topic of elections, as again, I'm sure everybody here knows, there was an election for one of the seats in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, the one formerly held by Alice Wolf, but for the last some years, 10 years, couldn't tell you, the seat has been held by Marjorie Decker, former city councilor Marjorie Decker. And I guess it was, I don't know whether it was expected or unexpected, but the election turned out to be quite close. In fact, on the Tuesday of election night, Evan MacKay or MacKay was announced. Well, it wasn't announced, but had he was 40 votes ahead, I believe 40 votes ahead, and then declared victory rather awkwardly, even though there were maybe several hundred absentee ballots, which I think a lot of us understood were going to break much more toward Marjorie Decker than toward MacKay. So anyway, so the following day, the election commission counted those ballots proper, and then the election flipped. So it went from a 40 vote deficit uh, for Marjorie to a 41 vote victory. Now, for those of us who understand the hardware and what's actually involved in this, we kind of understand a little bit about what happens when somebody asks for a recount. It's one thing if they're missing ballots or somebody made some egregious error, but for the most part, the scanners are really top-notch quality, and they read what's on the ballot. They really do. And so MacKay actually asked for a recount, and all of the people from the MacKay campaign were over up at the Sheila Russell Center on Huron Avenue last Thursday. And it was a kind of an all-day event where they were going through the paper ballots by hand, one by one by one, and then doing the recount. And in the end, I think there was two ballots that had been counted that were not counted for reasons I don't know why, and maybe one other oddball. Anyway, the margin of 41 votes did not change a bit, not by a single one. So lesson learned in these things: don't ask for recounts unless it's like we're talking like literally a handful of votes, because you're not going to see any change. Um, so I don't know that Marjorie has. I mean, she thanked all of her people, and it was a kind of a great event. I'll make no secret of the fact that I was very much hopeful that Marjorie would be reelected. I think what some people said about her during the campaign was deplorable, and really uncalled for. So it would have been a real tragedy had we had any outcome other than for her to prevail. But the lesson to be learned, I dare say, for anyone who's facing, and again, I'm all for incumbents having challengers. The notion that most of these seats go unchallenged to me is ridiculous. It may not be a all Massachusetts thing, but Massachusetts really suffers from this in a big bad way. So I welcome challengers, including MacKay's challenge of Decker. I think it was just some of the things that were said during the campaign that I found deplorable, not the fact that somebody challenged an incumbent. But I'm kind of hopeful that Marjorie will have a get together officially now that it's all over, and maybe I could even get invited and hoist a beer or two to congratulate Marjorie. I mean, I saw her up at the recount, so gave a preliminary congratulations anyway. But and by the way, things like recounts, for those of us who follow elections or were involved in some of these things, they have an almost a reunion like quality. So many of the people I know on the election commission I consider to be personal friends. There are other people who are actually lawyers who show up who are representing candidates some of them I hadn't seen in years, so they were there. uh, and supporters, many of whom are friends, were there. So it's you could argue that the recount was unnecessary, but I hope at least some good came out of it. But the lesson to be learned is that if you are an incumbent and you have an upstart um, challenger in a low turnout election, especially if it's an real sort of what we call activist kind of person, who can sort of energize their people to come out in disproportionate numbers, you can have upsets that are, I would argue, that are not really representative of the people in the district to be represented. So, word to the wise, my friends who happen to be occupying seats, take nothing for granted. You know, um, you know, you can get an oddball outcome. So anyway, so that you know that that's over and done with now, and when we sort of move on. All right. So again, as I say, this Thursday, we'll have another election related thing with the vacancy recount. and the inauguration, presumably, of Kathy Zusi to join to bring the city council back up to the requisite 9. Right. By the way, one thing, and I'll talk about this maybe a little bit as well, but when this Cambridge City Council returned from the summer break, had their first meeting of the fall on September 9th, there was there had been a matter on the midsummer agenda, so that would have been in August 5th, having to do with the process of charter change. And there was a recommendation came out of the Government Operations Committee that there were several, but one in particular was that the only proposals that should be forwarded eventually to the state legislature as part of a charter proposal should be ones that really do have a lot of consensus amongst councilors. And so the proposal was made that unless a proposed change to the charter has at least 2/3 support, it should not be included in what is forwarded to the state legislature. And then, should that be approved by the state legislature, would then come back to the Cambridge voters to be put on the ballot the following election. Now, much of this will probably take place next year, and presumably come back and we'll have something on the municipal ballot in November of 2025. All right, which actually, if you think about it, isn't that far off. All right, so there's a lot to go. So anyway, what happened is that it was expected that that was going to get the necessary majority for that city council order that would call for 2/3 support. But Joan Pickett had taken sick and eventually passed away, so she was not able to cast her vote. The vote initially had 5 votes to be a majority, nonetheless. But in the closing minutes of the midsummer meeting, Councillor Wilson asked for, to sort of go back to that question. Forget exactly what the procedure was, and but it's essentially like a reconsideration. But it was during the meeting, so I don't know if you technically call it that. And then I believe with some discussion with Councillor Siddiqui, she flipped her vote, which left it as at a 4 votes in favor, which is not a majority, 3 votes opposed, and 1 vote Councillor Azim voted present. So it didn't prevail. Now at the time I said, wait a minute, hold on. If Joan Pickett had been there, I'm quite sure she would have voted in favor of this, so it would have had majority support. So anyway, at the September 9th meeting, Joan Pickett had since passed away. And I thought it would only be appropriate if the city council would extend the courtesy. Now, you normally you can ask for, you can file for reconsideration of a vote, but you can only do so if you're on the prevailing side of the vote. In this case, Paul Toner was the one seeking reconsideration, was not on the prevailing side of the vote. So I know this is going to sound kind of arcane and procedural, but he actually had to first ask for suspension of the city council rules to allow it to be reconsidered, even though he was not on the prevailing side of the vote. And what I had written prior to the meeting, I said, just as that people extended a courtesy to Councillor Wilson to let her change her vote, I thought, especially in light of the death of Councillor Pickett, that it would be appropriate for the city council to not only suspend the rules to allow for reconsideration, but to then also reconsider the vote and lay it on the table until such time as we have a full complement of 9 city councilors, which would happen when Kathy Zusi joins. So, and to my, and again, I'm going to say this with great respect, the city council acted very appropriately in allowing reconsideration to prevail. They could have blocked it and allowed that vote, and the matter is now back on the table. I don't know whether it'll be acted upon immediately upon Kathy Zusi's joining the council, but presumably it won't be too much longer afterwards, and we'll likely then have the majority votes to pass. So anyway, we'll see how it plays out, but I thought it was, since it is related to the death of Joan Pickett, I thought it was appropriate to at least mention that the city council, they did right. They did right, and they deserve credit for doing so. All right, so I'm going to take my little artificial break here just so I can snip the program into two. So I'll see you shortly on Cambridge Inside Out.